and welcome. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see all of you here. Looking forward to our panel discussion on stakeholder capitalism in the Canadian context. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to do a land acknowledgement, then I'll introduce our panelists, and then we can get right into it. So starting with the land acknowledgement, I'd like to open today's meeting by acknowledging that the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists, and great to have you all here with me, starting not on my immediate left, but just to the left of Catherine, Rob Yalton, Sigurdsson Professor in Corporate Law and Finance at Queen's University and former senior partner at OSource. Welcome, Robert. Thanks for coming. Next to Robert, Barb Stymiest, Director of Sun Life and Weston, former CEO of the TSX Group, and lead writer of the ICD TSX report, Charting the Future of Canadian Governance. Barbara, welcome. Thanks for coming. And Bertrand Milot, Head of Sustainability at the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec. Welcome. And of course, our very own Catherine McCall. So over to you guys.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Welcome, and welcome to our panelists. Just a housekeeping matter. We're going to be pausing midway through the panel for audience questions, and then again towards the end. So if you do have questions, please hold them until I give the sign. And if you would like to ask a question, please come to the center of the room here where's the stand-up mic. So let's get started. Stakeholder capitalism refers to the idea that corporations should be run for the benefit of all stakeholders that are impacted by or that impact the corporation, and not for the benefit of simply of the shareholders who contribute the financial capital. And those stakeholders include employees, customers, the community, and even the environment. Stakeholder capitalism is generally contrasted with shareholder primacy, which is the view that the sole or primary purpose of the corporation is to create and enhance shareholder value. While arguably Canadian law has never embraced the shareholder primacy model, discussion has been occurring about a shift towards a stakeholder capitalism as a sort of is very dominant in the corporate governance Canadian ecosystem over the last few years. And we felt it was worth exploring what this shift means for shareholders and stakeholders, both theoretically and practically, in the context of the current Canadian legal and regulatory framework, and also our soft corporate governance laws. So are we talking about a meaningful evolution of corporate governance in Canada, or simply a reinforcement of the existing regime using a different terminology and different language? What, if anything, would have to be changed to make stakeholder capitalism a reality in Canada, and do we want that change? As we all know, in Canada, the settled law, both common and statutory, is that officers and directors are to run the corporation in the best interests of the corporation. Boards and officers may consider the interests of various stakeholders in determining those best interests, but the law is clear that the board's obligation is not to act in the best interests of those stakeholders. So stakeholder capitalism raises a lot of interesting questions, which we will be looking at today, such as which stakeholders' interests should be considered when determining the best interests of the corporation, how to balance those interests, those various, sometimes conflicting interests. So Rob, I'm going to start and by asking if you could provide an overview of the current Canadian corporate governance legal and regulatory framework as it relates to stakeholder capitalism, including whether or not the current regime allows for or facilitates stakeholder capitalism. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. I'm going to try and do this in 5 minutes, so let's see what we can do. So I'm going to start, let me start by saying I agree with you. Fiduciary duties are where I want to start. So fiduciary duties involve, and this is an important point, a very high standard of conduct that requires that one put the interests of the beneficiary of that duty first. And in Canada, it has long been the case that our corporate law statutes have said that directors have a fiduciary duty to the corporation. And the statutes have left it at that. That position can be contrasted with Delaware, the most important U.S. corporate law venue, where their law asserts that directors have a fiduciary duty to the corporation and to shareholders. So there's a difference between the two jurisdictions. And that distinction between the U.S. and Canada, unfortunately, hasn't always been clear to different players in Canada. So some have asserted that a corporation's interests should really be understood as somehow coextensive or identical with those of shareholders. And as an example, I've written extensively about how I think securities commissions, in particular in Canada, muddied the waters when hostile M&A was taking off in the 1980s and 1990s. Our commissions asserted regularly, repeatedly in that context, that directors had a duty to maximize value for shareholders. That was a line of thinking that was not rooted in our corporate law statutes. It was really about our securities commissions imposing U.S.-style thinking, but it was a popular line of thought at the time, influenced by strong currents at work in the United States. So the Supreme Court of Canada went out of its way in 2008 in the BCE case that Catherine was referring to assert that directors owe their fiduciary duty to the corporation alone. And it went on to say that that duty is not owed to shareholders or to any other stakeholder or constituency. The court said, as Catherine mentioned, that the board is entitled to consider the interests of different stakeholders, and that's a proposition that has more recently been added into the federal corporate law statute, the CBC Canada Business Corporations Act. But the court was quite clear that in its view, there's no fiduciary duty requiring a board to act in the best interests of one or more of these sets of stakeholders. The duty is to the corporation, the fiduciary duty is to the corporation. Now, the court's decision was criticized a lot at the time in many quarters. I always thought it was sound, in as much as it was simply confirming exactly what the statute says, that the duty is to the corporation. It is important to stress, I think, that our corporate law is the result of distinct Canadian policy choices about how that law should work. So we need to be really careful not to assume that the choices we've made in Canada are the same as choices that have been made in the United States or any other jurisdiction. But it isn't just that we've not embraced a hardcore shareholder primacy model in Canada, even if, of course, we do give shareholders remedies to ensure that directors live up to their duties, as well as voting rights that we don't give to any other stakeholder group. Voting rights on things like the election of directors or fundamental transactions. You may have seen recently that Tech had to pull a transaction because it wasn't getting shareholder support. But we've also given other stakeholders rights and remedies that make clear that our corporate law does take into account the interests of other stakeholders. But we haven't done it through the fiduciary duty route. This is an important point. For example, directors are subject to somewhat softer duties of care. These are duties that require them not to be negligent and to consider the impact of their actions on parties that may be harmed by their actions. In an earlier case, some of you may have heard of called Peoples, the Supreme Court of Canada asserted that under the federal statute, again, the Canada Business Corporations Act, these duties can be owed to any stakeholder whose interests are engaged by a given decision, for example, creditors or shareholders. So here we have a softer kind of duty that's very context dependent. It depends, and depending on the facts, it may well be open to one or more affected group to, under the federal statute, to bring an action alleging a breach of that duty of care that has caused them harm. I should note that it's not every jurisdiction in Canada that takes as expansive an approach to this duty of care as the federal statute. Ontario was very quick after the Supreme Court came out with its People's decision to amend the Ontario statute to make clear that the duty of care was owed only to the corporation, not to potentially any stakeholder. It doesn't stop there, that we have other remedies, another remedy in the corporate law that doesn't exist in the United States, known as the oppression remedy. And in many Canadian jurisdictions, it allows not just shareholders, but also certain other stakeholders, notably debt holders, and with the leave of the court, other groups such as creditors, to bring an action alleging that their interests have been unfairly prejudiced or unfairly disregarded. Again, this imposes a softer duty than a fiduciary duty on directors, but it's there nevertheless. And so again, I think it shows you that our legal system does expect directors to turn their mind to the impact of their actions on different stakeholders. These duties are soft, that's the term I'm using, just to contrast them to these fiduciary duties, soft, in the sense as well that directors get the benefit of quite a bit of deference from our courts. Courts don't view themselves as there to second-guess directors, so they are quite deferential to boards. One observation I'd make about these soft duties, though, is that while certain groups are specified in certain instances, like the oppression remedy, where they call it particular groups, it's not always clear what other groups might succeed in invoking those remedies. So the oppression remedy leaves the door open to courts allowing those groups that it thinks appropriate to bring that kind of claim forward, but it doesn't define all the other stakeholders that might have access to it. So let me bring this to an end at my 5-minute summary. I may have gone slightly over, sorry. In summary, there are different instances in which our legal framework requires directors to consider stakeholder interests, but we don't impose this very high fiduciary duty on directors to act in their best interests. So they've got to consider the interests, but you don't have to act in their best interests. That duty, that fiduciary duty, is reserved for the corporation. I hope that gives you a reasonably good snapshot. I just want to observe that I think we do understand at least 3 things today better than we did maybe 40 years ago, namely that we have made distinct policy choices in Canada, and so our legal framework is not structured the same way as in the US. Second, our legal framework certainly leaves plenty of room for boards to think about a range of stakeholder interests. They are permitted to do so. Something which I think even our securities commissions now acknowledge. We may come to that in the conversation today. And finally, I just want to stress that in some instances, our legal framework actually does impose what I've called soft duties to think about certain stakeholders. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Rob. I will be coming back to some of your comments, I think, later in the discussion. That sets a great foundation. Thank you. Barb, what does stakeholder capitalism mean for directors, both in theory and in practice? And I wondered if you could talk about the relevance of the new report that you authored, the TSX and the ICD report on charting the future of Canadian governance.
Okay, thank you, Catherine, and it's great to be here with this fine group that I was involved with right at the inception of it. I would just remind you that the committee was formed to review corporate governance and our guidelines 3 years ago, relatively early in the pandemic. I'm pretty sure there were no lawyers on our committee, so we didn't actually go at it from a legal perspective. But the ICD organized, I think, 9 virtual roundtables, and there were subjects at each table, but they tended to be the topics du jour. The topics du jour haven't really changed, but they were topics about purpose of the corporation, strategy, culture, a lot of the things, diversity, equity, inclusion, a lot of the things that were swirling around board tables, and asked the director community what they thought. These roundtables were transcribed, trying to find the nuggets in the opinions of the director community that were there. In the end, it was difficult to write a report from a group of 9 roundtables, but what the committee decided was that we looked at the world through the lens of, wow, it's fast changing and there's so much going on, and the expectations around the broader communities of what corporations should and could deliver were escalating rapidly. The social pressures were immense. We had everything early on in our discussions from George Floyd to the pandemic, like just everything was moving. So we really ended up actually with a working title of the report called Meeting Rising Expectations in a Fast Changing World. And this was really meant to encompass the fact that there was a huge pull. There's a huge pull for corporations and huge expectations broadly for companies to deliver more than just shareholder value. And we acknowledged that this meant a redefinition of the relationship between the corporation and its stakeholders. And ultimately, the report says that the board should demand that management effectively move to a multi-stakeholder world. And that's kind of the bottom line of the report. It didn't get there overnight. It got there over 3 years of discussion, but we landed there. We understood that this transition was happening in this crazy external context. As I was writing the report, I mean, it was, we'd start with the issues around the pandemic, and then it moved to issues around George Floyd, and then it moved to issues around truth and reconciliation, and there just seemed to be more and more continuous challenges that we were facing, and finally the war in the Ukraine, which put everyone's kind of geopolitical assumptions at peril. So we recognized that. We recognized this pull. We recognized people expected more. And so what we tried to do was to provide a handbook or a set of principles that would help directors lead their corporations in doing their jobs differently. So it's a kind of how-to set of principles. It was meant to bring new guidance and frameworks to boards in the areas that probably will never change, but also where there isn't a lot of guidance. And I think that includes strategy, risk, and culture. There's a sentence or two in our corporate, I think Catherine referred to them as our soft corporate guidelines. There's a sentence or two about risk. There's a sentence or two about having an annual strategy session. There's just not a lot of guidance out there. And I know that a colleague of mine is in the room who's done a search in terms of the 2 million books that are written on strategy. When you search those books, it doesn't tell you what a board should do about strategy. It's guidance to management on how to do strategy. So there was a gap. So we were trying to fill gaps, and we were trying to fill the gaps in the context of these expectations and the move to multi-stakeholderism. So we also recognized there were a bunch of new areas that we had to deal with. And, but first and foremost, as we thought about multi-stakeholderism, Chapter 1 is about know who they are. And I know it's shorthand to say it's obviously the employees, it's obviously the customers, but I think it's far more nuanced. I was reading some ESG reports for an upcoming meeting that I'm having next week, and their list of stakeholders has probably 20. So the nuances of really who your stakeholders are and knowing who they are is critical, and engaging with them. I'm usually not very impressed when I see that someone did a survey 2 years ago and outsourced it. I'm not sure that's really engaging and having a dialogue with your stakeholders to know what they really care about and really want. Obviously, you need to have very good processes for your employees, and you really need to understand your customers, but I think the world is way more complicated, and surveys every other year just don't cut it for me. So we decided that that was important. The next chapter led into ESG, which I think is a proxy for meeting the broader expectations of stakeholders. So once you know who they are, then you need to actually craft a strategy. You need to choose what is important and relevant to your company, and that's done through the engagement and identification and discussion with your stakeholders. We recognized that most of the aspects of companies' performance are interconnected and complex, and that we had to sharpen the focus on the value creation beyond the share price. And I know that sounds simple, but we are so focused. Our entire capital markets infrastructure, our analyst community, everyone's focused on did they meet or beat the analyst expectations. It's all down to the earnings per share. And I think that the movement away from solely focused on results and value creation for shareholders means you have to build something that doesn't exist. You have to know what measures are important, and you must, within a corporation, if you measure what's important and you deliver on that you're building value, and that what we're really trying to get at is a holistic view of a stakeholder strategy that creates value across all the dimensions of performance without hurting shareholder value. So this is an optimization challenge. It is not about sacrificing shareholder value. It is about optimizing and making the pie bigger than it would be if you ignored the other stakeholders. We believe that there was a broader lens to be brought to risks and opportunities. Our chapter on risk says that, and that we really believe that boards have to hold management accountable to measure and report on the value creation to the relevant stakeholders. I put in lots of examples in the measurement chapter. I mean, if Air Canada is accountable to its customers, then shouldn't they be reporting on when the planes take off on time and whether their customers get their luggage? I think that's relevant to people who use an airline. So that were the kind of examples that we gave, in addition to the earnings per share, in addition to what they're doing to the environment when they burn jet fuel. So it's really easy, I think, to move from shareholder profits to the broader impacts that all stakeholders will be thinking about. I just want to briefly, if I've got another minute, just say that we didn't come at this uniquely from a Canadian perspective. We were watching what was going on around the world. We were watching, what was being written in the Harvard Business Review. We cited everything. In May 2021. Their lead article was How to Lead in the Stakeholder Era. If you saw the Harvard Business Review article this month, you'll know it's on how to create a stakeholder strategy. I think they're reasonably credible. McKinsey has been writing about this and providing guidance, and they're actually, they're already into operationalizing it. So they're well past whether you should or shouldn't. It's the how-to. Some of you would know Bruce Simpson. He was widely quoted in the article from McKinsey. For those of you who read the report, I think our message is that this is a really complicated transition. It's not simple. It's not going to be quick. Our principles in each chapter are going to be, take time to work through. But it implies, what the report doesn't say, but I'd like to put on the table, is that it's probably time for Canada to lead this transition. I think Canada's reputation for strong governance, and our committee was absolutely unanimous on this, it's been stellar. And I was at the table because I was a board member and ultimately the chair and then the CEO of the exchange, where we were invited to the tables around the world who were trying to reform their governance over 25 years ago. And so, we come from a position of strength. And what we've also seen is other jurisdictions have changed their governance guidelines. Nobody's taken the multi-stakeholder approach yet. So really what we did was new and groundbreaking, and I think it is an opportunity for Canada to lead. And why not? We are a strong capitalist democracy. Our country has a long-standing global reputation as a society that places great value on the principles of fairness and shared success. And as this evolution really to the capitalist model is based on the core values that really represent what we as Canada believe in, it's an opportunity where Canada can show leadership in defining and advancing rather than lagging or resisting the change in this transition. So my personal hope is that the directors who understand that high-performing corporations contribute to our prosperity, that these boards will work with their management teams to balance and optimize the demands of multiple stakeholders. They will navigate the uncertainties of today's world, and they will collectively manage the multitude of intersecting risks and oversee and overhaul the performance measurement systems. There's a lot to be done, and I'm really excited about hopefully the impact that we can have through our report.
Thank you, Barb. Turning to you, Bertrand, from the investor's perspective, what does stakeholder capitalism mean for institutional investors and how they approach their stewardship responsibilities to their beneficiaries and clients? I'm interested in, for example, whether stakeholder interests are taken into account by institutional investors when they're making voting decisions. What are the impacts on institutional investors of this perspective?
Well, thank you, Catherine. Thank you for having invited me Just a quick reminder who CDPQ is: $402 billion pension plan, long-term liabilities, long-term investment outlook. And we've had our first proxy voting policy in 1994. So we've been at the game of ESG for quite some time. But our first objective, and this is very important, is to generate an attractive risk-adjusted return for our depositors. Second, to do it sustainably, in that order. So that said, we question ourselves as to what is a company. And a number of eminent people, Martin Lipton, Larry Fink, have opined that a company's purpose is to create value over the long term. And if a company loses its license to operate, it will succumb to short-term pressures and ultimately deliver subpar returns to shareholders. I think also a company is a legal construct, but really it's some sort of blender in which you put staff, clients, suppliers, competitors, lenders, providers of money, regulators, local communities, the planet, and shareholders, also providers of money, different form. And in order to succeed, in order for that blend to taste good, you need to balance it. You need to balance it over the long term, and that's very, very important. So I'll respond to your question using a counter-example. And unfortunately, corporate news or corporate disasters provide plenty of examples of what could go wrong. I chose to pick on Boeing, which is one of the most egregious examples of losing track of this. You think that making planes involves 10 years of R&D. It costs billions of dollars. Your order books are multi-year. You have symbiotic relationship with your suppliers. An aircraft engine and a plane, they go together. You don't shop for aircraft engines at Home Depot. So they work together. It's a business that is eminently long-term, yet Boeing decided about 10, 15 years ago to move its headquarters from Seattle to Chicago, and then they've moved on further because the company was too engineering-related, too focused on technical issues, and they needed to create shareholder value. They then focused, all the attention of management was on the share price for a while. And the result was they were, worrying about various financial optimizations and, playing with shares and dividends and things like that, cost-cutting on a massive scale. And in the end, they completely lost track of their roots. They lost track of their business. They focused on short-term things when the business is one of the most long-term business you can find on the planet. And the result we know, 346 innocent people killed, shareholder value destruction on a grand scale, the grounding of planes for years, huge loss of confidence, and a large increase in the company's debt that resulted in its slowing its ability to invest in its future. And I think also, you think stakeholders, Boeing, I see a regulator as a risk department, an external risk department. In the case of the FAA, looking at planes saying, well, this doesn't work, you need to fix it, this is good, we're okay with it, we've double-checked it. Instead of Boeing valuing this, they capture the regulator. Instead of listening to them, they viewed them as an ally, as an enemy, and captured it because it was preventing the creation of shareholder value. And the result now is the regulators are doubling or tripling their scrutiny on Boeing products. So that's one example. There's plenty of other examples. Uber, with their toxic culture, bullying of regulators and treating their drivers poorly, et cetera, et cetera. So to us, it's very, very important for the long-term benefit of our depositors that the balance of those interests be worked on, that the value of each one of these players be considered by management, and that management looks much further than just shareholder value in the short term, looks long term, and look as to what they put in the blender. And every single ingredient, very, very important. And of course, we will take that into account when we vote, when we interact with management. Voting is one tool, it's a bit crude, but certainly engaging management is something we do on a regular basis.
I wanted now to turn to one of the issues that some see as a problem with stakeholder capitalism. And that is, and acknowledging Rob's point about
softer duties owed to stakeholders and the existence of different means of redress on the part of these stakeholders. There is an apparent accountability gap in stakeholder capitalism, and how are stakeholders to hold boards to account for taking their interests into consideration? Because shareholders obviously have a direct mechanism through voting for directors and voting in other matters where they can hold boards accountable. Other stakeholders have no such direct mechanism. They can only react after the fact when things have gone wrong, relying on legal remedies such as the oppression remedy or a breach of duty lawsuit, or they can resort to less formal mechanisms that are outside the corporate or legal structure, such as public pressure through social media campaigns. So I wanted to ask you, Rob, what challenges, if any, do you think our current framework presents to a functioning shareholder capitalism? And would the law have to change in Canada to have true stakeholder capitalism? Wouldn't it be more in keeping with the goals of stakeholder capitalism if the board, which determines how to balance these stakeholder interests in the best interest of the corporation, were to be composed of stakeholder representatives, such as employees and customers, in addition to those elected by shareholders?
Okay, another tough one. Again, try and do this 5 minutes or less. So it seems to me you have to distinguish between three different things. First of all, what or who do we want boards to have to think about? Secondly, who do we want to have able to hold directors accountable, and through what kind of accountability mechanisms? And third, who do we want sitting on boards of directors? Here, the last point. So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, different countries have made different choices. And how a country answers each of those questions has a big impact on the kind of capitalism that it's embracing. So we need to ask ourselves, okay, what choices have we made? And I tried to give you an overview of that in my opening observations. And then we have to ask, okay, do we think we need to revise or adjust those choices as reflected in our legal framework in order to advance and optimize stakeholder capitalism? And how you respond to this challenge will reveal a lot about the kind of stakeholder capitalism you want to embrace. And I think that's an important point, because I think there are actually a lot of different stakeholder capitalism models out there that different groups call for. They're not always on the same page. They're not always talking about the same thing. So on the first question about who a board should have to think about, again, I explained that we do ask our boards to think about stakeholders, imposing soft duties to do so in some contexts, but not imposing fiduciary duties with respect to one or more stakeholders. We could change that, of course, and there are those out there that argue that we should have fiduciary duties to act in the best interests of employees or other stakeholders, or maybe even the environment. There's a recent report out of the Suzuki Foundation calling for just that with respect to the environment. But these are political choices. They involve big policy decisions. And for my part, I'd be reluctant to adopt a model that suggests that it should always be the case that boards must seek to advance the interests of one or more specific group of stakeholders. My own experience working with boards when I was in practice for 25 years, and what you've heard from Barb suggests to me that that's too rigid, it's too simplistic a way of coming at things. Boards have to balance a lot of competing considerations, and it doesn't make sense to me anyhow to say that only one group's interests must always prevail. So I'd prefer to see us thinking harder about how we use what I've been calling these soft set of duties. I don't think that way of looking at things gets enough attention. It tends to get lost in people arguing that there should be fiduciary duties to this group or that group. That brings us then to the question about, okay, what legal rights, what accountability mechanisms should we give to stakeholders, different stakeholder groups, to hold boards accountable, and what kinds of rights? I've mentioned we in fact have given legal rights not just to shareholders, but to other groups, but we don't talk enough about whether we think we've struck the right balance. As I explained earlier, shareholders, debt holders, sometimes creditors have remedies under many corporate statutes in Canada, but the breadth of those remedies varies from one jurisdiction to another in Canada. And we don't make it easy, certainly for groups like employees, to, for example, to bring an action against a board of directors alleging that that the board has harmed the employees' interests. This question of how you enable stakeholders to hold a board accountable once you've said the board should be thinking about them has come up in other jurisdictions as well, like the UK. It's tried to build in stakeholder-friendly language in its corporate law, only to see people criticize that as essentially a toothless exercise because there are no remedial powers given to the stakeholders referred to hold the board accountable. So I'd like to see us engage in a more systematic analysis in Canada of who we think should be able to hold boards to account and through what remedies. I think that's an important issue. If we turn next to voting rights and board representation, again, these are big social choices. There are countries like Germany, various Scandinavian countries that require employee representation on certain public company boards. They give employees voting rights with respect to the election of employee directors. It can be done. But is it necessary in order to have stakeholder capitalism? The answer to that question, I think, depends on your conception of what stakeholder capitalism really means. For my part, I'm not sure it is necessary, and it would involve a pretty radical overhaul of the foundations of how we've set up our corporate law model in Canada, obviously. Yeah. And I certainly worry that we'll undercut board effectiveness if we go even further than these European countries have, and instead of choosing people that we think are well placed to make challenging business decisions that involve having to balance different interests, we choose instead to make the board a place where different constituencies get a representative, if you will, just to come to the last question you asked. And then we let these different constituencies have at it or butt heads in the boardroom, fight it out. It seems to me there are good reasons why no country actually has chosen that model. I don't think it's really workable. But I think you can have a form of stakeholder capitalism without embracing as extreme a model of that. And I think you can even have a form of stakeholder capitalism without embracing the co-determination model I referred to that, again, is used in some European countries that allows for employee representation on the board. But that doesn't mean I'm an advocate for the status quo in Canada. I think there is room in Canada to look at whether we've got the right mix between the hard and soft duties I've been describing that we impose on boards of directors, and the remedies made available to different stakeholders to ensure directors are living up to those duties. There's a lot that's slowly built up in our system over decades that's more opaque than it should be, and I think we'd benefit from shining some light on it and asking ourselves whether we're happy with the mix of choices we've made or whether we should be more explicit about the soft duties that are owed to different stakeholders and the remedies that those stakeholders should have to ensure the board lives up to those duties. So that's as much as I can cram into 5 minutes.
Thank you. That's very interesting in response. Thank you for that. Barb, I wanted to just carry on, with the same ideas or thoughts about the accountability gap that I think does exist, but in stakeholder capitalism. But Rob is maybe changing my mind. Various stakeholder interests will not always be aligned, no matter how long-term a perspective you adopt. I think that's sort of undeniable. So how are directors to balance the conflicting interests, and what are the criteria for doing that? And is there any guidance in the Charting the Future report that would help with that, directors with that?
Yeah, let me say simply that yes, there is a lot of guidance, but I'd like to stand back a bit. I think we're all lucky that we've been living in the last number of decades that Rob just referred to. There's a lot of work that I do on another board related to the science of happiness, and I think understanding that we are lucky to live in a world where work should be fun. Play should be fun, your family life should be fun, and it's good to be in good health. Like, these are the fundamental human needs. So starting with having an organization where people want to work, probably because the organization has a great purpose, is delighting its customers, and if all that is aligned, then the returns are going to, the growth, the success of the company will be self-reinforcing. So to me, it isn't about balance, it's actually about creating the win-win or the optimization, and nowhere in the report does it talk about trade-offs or zero-sum games. It's all about optimization, that these are virtuous circles, that happy, engaged employees working in a diverse and inclusive environment will, and really thoughtful, clear value propositions for clients that are delighted will build the success that will also deliver the shareholder returns. So this ecosystem that and understanding as a leader, for those of you who have been a CEO or admire great CEOs, they don't come to work and they don't get people out of bed in the morning to deliver shareholder value. They get people out of bed in the morning to delight clients, to come and be with their friends and create a great product or service. So if you hold and understand, the fundamental purpose of what corporations do and understand human nature, I think that the legal issues are important, but they're rarely talked about inside a boardroom. I don't think they're talked about much at an executive table either, because I think first and foremost, people are there to create the delightful experience for clients, provide an environment where employees love to work, have great relationships with their suppliers and the other communities in which they operate that will deliver success and growth and shareholder returns. So this ecosystem and interconnectedness is what's written about a lot in the report. But to do that, recognizing that's an ecosystem, I go back to what I said at the outset. It's about measuring, being clear, understanding, communication, and then as an accountant, I can't tell you enough that saying that you have 42% women on your board or things like that, sort of like you have 2 arms and 2 legs. What does that mean? Well, an accountant actually knows that when you measure something, you have usually a goal, you have a budget, you trend it, you benchmark it, you know what your competitors are doing. So when we actually put the discipline of good measurement to the things that matter, whether that's employee engagement, employee inclusiveness, whether you put the measurement to what your customers say about your product or service, and you trend it and you benchmark it and you do all of those things, that in addition to knowing whether your shareholder returns are as good as your competitors, you will actually know whether your employee value proposition is as good as your competitors, where your goods and services and what your customers think of you are as good as your competitors, and you will build this reinforcing ecosystem. So I think the report says that, and I think that's why there's a lot written about measurement, there's a lot written about the importance of culture, there's a lot written about the importance of leadership in organizations that can drive these changes, and it's not so much the legal guardrails that matter, because that's when things go wrong. This is about changing and creating a better structure and process to make things go better, as opposed to avoid things going off the rails.
Good, thank you. Sticking with the accountability theme, Bertrand, under the current mechanisms that we have, I think it's the expectation is that it's shareholders that are going to hold boards to account for how they manage these various interests, or, well, balance or not, based on what Barb has said. Under stakeholder capitalism, it's still shareholders that hold boards accountable, and I wanted to know, what are your expectations of boards with respect to this, and are the boards meeting these expectations?
Thank you. First, I'd like to come back on what Barb just said as another example, Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse, Barb was talking about accounting, all these niceties which are boring. Credit Suisse forgot that trust is the key to a bank. And that big bank with a storied history came out one day, oh, well, I can't certify my account. And 2 weeks later, it's gone. There you go. So, yeah, all these niceties need to be taken on board, and that is key. And the stakeholders there are the regulators, the public, the clients, everybody. So, on your question, I've spent the last 2 weeks anticipating this conversation to go over and talk to a few board members that I know, some of them of large Canadian corporates. And what I heard was somewhat concerning, I have to say. A lot of the message that came through was the question of boards being captured by management, basically they are fed information from management and don't have sufficient information from the outside world to be able to actually consider stakeholder issues, because all they hear is the stuff that is distilled by management. Another question also I heard was the fact that often management treats board as an advisor or as a sounding board. And the question there is, when is management and the board too close? And our view is that the board needs to keep management in check. They don't necessarily need to advise management. They need to ask the right questions. And then sometimes that threshold is lost, and then you end up with insufficient independence to make sure that there is a sufficient outside view that is being considered. Also, a lot of common complaints is we're showered with details, and there is not enough strategic thinking. And not enough question like, what if this happens, is being asked of management. So to answer your question, I think we expect boards to think long-term, to listen to or to consider their long-term shareholders. And I'm not saying that because we're a pension plan, but rather because our interests are aligned with that of the corporation over the long term, not the local hedge fund who is interested in its profits in the next 5 minutes. There needs to be something that's closer to what happens in well-run family companies where the board and management think about the welfare of the next generation of the family, as opposed to what happens to this generation. So I think, a few points that come to mind. The independence of members of the board, very important. We all know this, and I mean independence. I mean not being friendly with everybody, not being a great family. There needs to be independence of thinking. Diversity, and I wouldn't argue 1 minute that we need to have representative of the employees on boards. We need to have representative of the local communities, because boards are not going to work, and I fully agree with Rob. It's not supposed to be the United Nations. It's supposed to be a professional body, taking care of a company. However, if there was a diverse board already has built-in diversity, i.e. listening to all sorts of views. And there needs to be a culture of listening. Very, very important, and that comes to the chair of the board. The chair of the board needs to make sure that all the opinions are listened to and dealt with. Very, very important to ensure that there is the proper dialogue. Should encourage management to do the same, by the way. Keep a safe distance from management, ask constructive questions, but don't necessarily provide the answers. See what comes up. I think there is, and this came from a number of people, the need for the board to be fed information directly from outside, to hire their own consultants, their own people, and get their own report, not the view of management, but rather their own things, to be able to gauge those questions of stakeholders by themselves, and then ask the questions of management. Have you looked into this? Are you aware of that? As opposed to listen to them, and they may have missed some things. The world is complicated these days. The same with regards to employees. There are some very important employees in companies that are not in the C-suite. Are the boards talking to them? Are the boards getting fed exit interviews that have not been adulterated by senior management? Are the boards receiving the results of employee surveys directly? Because the boards need to ask questions, need to ask tough questions, and the people I talk to are not sure they are able to do that. The what-if question, scenario analysis in climate change, but there may be other scenarios that need to be considered. What if this happens? What happens to the company? Today, what if our main supplier of whatever product that we absolutely rely on to produce our own things disappears or ends up being embargoed by some foreign government? Are those questions being discussed? I'm not sure. Questioning the status quo. There is a lot and I'm referring specifically to executive pay, where we see, oh, well, this is the market practice. At which point do we need to change the market practice so that the stakeholders have an influence in, taking into account stakeholder issues is reflected in the way you incentivize management. And I think the question, I started talking about that, the license to operate. What does this mean for a company, for a specific company? Is this ever discussed? So I think that's what we expect of boards. Right. A much broader and more high-level dialogue. Of course, the board needs to supervise the day-to-day-ish and certify the, approve the accounts and all that stuff. Yes, they must do that, but they must also just elevate themselves above management and ask the right questions. And the problem is the world is so complicated today with cybersecurity and geopolitics and all that stuff. The board needs to be fed from the outside more and more, in our view.
Thank you. I'm going to stop here and ask if there are any questions from the audience. Does anybody, we've covered a lot of ground. Does anybody, oh, Rosa. Oh, the mic, yeah. Can you come around the front, yeah.
Hi everyone, it's Rosa Vandenbeemt. I'm Director of Stewardship for BMO Global Asset Management. I really appreciated the panel, so thank you so much. My question is around this idea that boards should have maybe a more direct line to stakeholders that is unfiltered from what they get from management. We've been asking some questions here and there of the companies that we invest in. Are there any best practices that any of you see emerging in that space? One example that comes to mind for me is a Canadian company that has board of directors hold annual events with stakeholders that they've identified where they can ask questions and raise topics, but are there any other mechanisms, maybe through formal grievance mechanisms that are already set up or others that you've seen anywhere in the global marketplace emerging? Thank you.
Yes, Barb.
I'll just a quick intervention. For those of you who know the Corporate Governance Code in the national instrument, it is quite clear that boards are mandated to receive feedback from stakeholders independent of management. I would say that most companies don't do that, and most companies actually focus on a little bit of outreach directly from the chair of the board and often the chair of the compensation committee to major shareholder outreach, but very rarely are actually proactive in receiving the feedback. So I think your question is a great one. What are best practices? I think at a minimum, I think people need to pay attention to what's in our existing corporate governance guideline. And I think it needs to be more proactive and outreach as opposed to waiting for, even if there is some email address or something that exists for stakeholders to contact directors. I have never seen it in 25 years of being on a board, a matter ever coming to a board from a stakeholder. I've only ever heard reports about shareholder engagement with independent members of the board. So we're a long way from where you're suggesting we need to be.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rosa. Anybody else have any questions before I... Hi.
Hi, Eric Morgan from Cushman Eric Morgan here in Toronto. I had a question about the theme of accountability and remedies, picking up on Rob, your topic. Recently in the UK, a group of Shell shareholders started a derivative action against the directors for not managing climate change risk. And I'm just wondering, is that something you see emerging? Substantively, it's pushing a stakeholder issue, but the sort of procedurally it's done through the shareholders. So is that sort of a transition way of advancing stakeholder issues?
Good question. Is that directed to anybody in particular? Or
Maybe
just-
Rob, I think.
Although I think Bertrand wants to
Oh, go ahead.
get in it. Let me start and then I'll pass it on to Bertrand. There are different layers to the remedies problem, but if we look just at the question of corporation, the directors acting in the best interest of the corporation and how you enforce that, there is this remedy called the derivative action that allows shareholders and potentially other parties to go to court and say the company's fallen down on the job. And it hasn't lived up to its fiduciary duties, but it's extremely difficult to get access to, even for shareholders. It's convoluted and complicated, and even more difficult for other constituencies. So there's one example of a remedial problem that we need to think about. The oppression remedy, hasn't been designed so that people can bring claims saying you did bad stuff to the environment. It's not why the remedy was originally created, but it's easier for some constituencies to get access to that remedy. And so that's why I'm just encouraging us to think about two things. Do we want to be more explicit about some of the things we expect of boards without necessarily raising it to the level of fiduciary, but hey, we actually expect you, we think you have a duty to think about this group and that group and this issue. First of all, and that, should we be more explicit about it? And secondly, who should be able, if the board's falling down on the job, to bring, to have access to a remedy that actually lets them seek damages or action of some kind. That stuff's really important. It sounds, it is lawyery stuff, but it's important because it does put pressure on boards. In my time in practice, I saw the oppression remedy in particular forcing boards to think about more than shareholders, forcing them to think about debt holders. It took lawyers to say, hey, you actually need to think about this stuff, but without that framework there, it wasn't going to happen. And then, debt holders started suing boards. And so, oh, wait a minute, okay, there's another constituency we have to think about. There was an evolution in thinking over so I think it would be healthy if we had a more systematic discussion about, okay, duties to whom, what kind of duties, what kind of remedies, because things like the derivative, that's not an easy path. It's actually, there's got to be a better way than having to rely on that. So hope that's a suitable answer, Bertrand.
Thank you.
Yeah, I won't go that technical, but I would say that this is a classic example of climate change where companies need to think long term. And people might say, well, climate change in the next 2 years, who cares? Well, maybe or maybe not, actually. We were talking recently to a company in the power sector, which is facing tens of millions of dollars of additional costs today because the trees grow faster. And this is in 2023, because the shorter winters and hotter summers mean the trees grow faster, and so they have to clear them more, and that's tens of millions of dollars. So that happens. The problem is in most companies, it's not that critical, and so boards tend to just brush the thing away. Where there is increasing evidence, if you look beyond your own company and outside again, inform yourself from the outside, that this issue is increasingly important and for all the companies. So our strategy here is to put pressure on boards, and then, as I say, casually, to show teeth at some point through, say, on climate, and I know this is a highly controversial tool, which is a bit blunt, admittedly, and also at some point to just basically act to not re-elect certain directors if the issue is not taken on board. And the point is not to tell them what to do, is to force them to consider the issue and tell us what they're planning to do about it.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Eric. Anybody else have any questions? Because we're, hi. It's hard to see in the lights. Come on up. Hi, Catherine.
So a lot of stakeholders have a relationship with the company that is contractual. When you think of debt holders and you think of employees, you know, as many of your customers also. And so I wonder how you think about when boards have to take into consideration their interests of whether or not if meeting those contractual obligations gets you a long way there. Like how are you thinking about balancing these interests? And the second question I have is, we're starting to put a lot of greater society expectations on this quite narrow part of the corporate universe, the publicly traded ones. And so I'm wondering if some of these the stakeholder interests would be better brought through more active government intervention so that all corporations were being held to these standards. So I just wondered for the panelists what you think of those issues.
Great question.
Maybe I'll pick up that last point. We make no difference whether the corporate is private or public. To us, it's the same issue. So it's a company that has a business and has stakeholders, and they need to take them into account in the same way.
Well, I can try on the contractual one. So a couple of thoughts for you. Yes, it's true that some stakeholders have contractual relations, but there are also stakeholders who don't. And it is important that we think about what obligations a board should have to think about the interests of groups that aren't in a contractual relationship with a company. Some of my former students are in the room, so forgive me when I say this. They've heard it before, but shareholders are not in a contractual relationship with a company. They're in a statutorily defined relationship. Their rights are governed by a statute. They don't sign a contract with the company. So there's a huge example of a group that is not in a contractual relationship. The statute imposes obligation on directors to think about their interests through duties like the oppression remedy, which says you're not to unfairly prejudice or unfairly disregard the interests of shareholders, right? So what we're doing with these statutes is layering on duties on directors to think about groups that may not be in contractual relationships, and even if they're in contractual relationships, they may not have negotiated a very good contract, right? We still want boards to think about their interests, and so the theme I'm kind of running here is let's think about, okay, which groups should a board have to think about? How high a standard do we want? And then what kind of remedies do we want to give different groups if they feel that they've been hard done by, right? And so it's, we've ended up in a place where boards do have some duties to some groups, but it's not very systematic, the system we have. I want to make sure that message gets out. We are sort of stakeholdery, but we haven't really thought it through very, in a really careful way. It's more productive, adjusting here and there as we've gone along. So
And
that gives you some answer.
To Catherine's point about
Yeah.
maybe these are broader social or political issues.
Yes, they are.
I mean, they
Yeah.
have to be considered not just within the corporate structure, but more socially.
Right. So we want to impose a duty on boards to think about the environment. Nothing's stopping us from doing it. I'm not making the case for it. I'm just saying you could do it. Then the next question would be, okay, who's going to, if they fall down on the job, who do we think should hold them accountable? Just shareholders, or do we open the door to other groups and say, certain other groups? Okay, which groups? Why? Right? We need to have that conversation. We've done it in certain areas. I keep using the suppression remedy example because it is an area where we've opened the door a little bit to other groups.
Interesting. I think there was one other question.
Two.
Oh, two? Okay, thank you. Oh, hi. Okay, we'll just do these and then we're going to.
Interested in what you think the current ESG ecosystem will push this conversation. So the requirements for ESG data to inform sustainable investments, the rise of rating agencies, and the ever-evolving international norms and frameworks. How much is this going to push this conversation?
Should I take?
Oh, sure. Bertrand?
I think it will help the conversation. You know, the investors require more ESG data because that is precisely how we're going to be able to measure which company, or measure is a big word, have a view as to which company is better suited for the future than the other ones. There are key metrics that are very, very important to businesses. Some of them are soft. Some of them are measurable, but we need to have a better view in order to make informed investment decisions, definitely. And so having better norms and better ways of doing things is welcome, and I think the ISSB and all these bodies that are worrying about these things are good. I would caution, though, on the fact that there may be too much of an effort to try to normalize or standardize things, and I think we need to be careful that what applies to a bank does not apply to a cement company. And so you need to be, and this is the trick, because there is this, at the moment, there is companies need to report, the metrics need to apply to their business, but then the people certifying it potentially, or who are planning to certify, are not necessarily capable of doing that, and it certainly goes against the grain that goes about what goes in finance, where the financial metrics for a bank or the accounting rules for a bank and a cement company are, okay, there's slight differences, but it's pretty much the accounting rules, where in ESG matters, it's much more varied than that. But we're welcoming this.
Thank you, Barb.
I mean, I just think it's always worth remembering Bill Gates' book, I think, put it beautifully, that the lever of capital allocation to public companies is a very, very small part of the solution. The solution to a lot of our problems relates to government policy, innovation, and the role of corporations, public and private, where private capital is just as much at play. So, some of you would remember when our skies were brown until we put in regulations to, make people's smokestacks, block the particles that were going into the air. We remember when sewage was going into our lakes and rivers. That was government policy. I think a lot about innovation, and I think it's important for both companies to have great innovation in terms of how they continue to move their company forward and deliver better products and services to their customers. But I think an innovation framework for this country is really important. And it's innovation. For example, we could have nuclear fusion by mid-30s, and that would solve a lot of our climate change problems. So those are the other things. And I would agree with what Bertrand said, that we can overcook the amount of disclosure, particularly for companies that are letting disclosure be the tail that wags the dog. And that you really, companies need to focus on what matters to them and what matters to their stakeholders. And we don't need to do to ESG disclosure what we've done to financial disclosure and whatever it said in the paper last week, that no human being can possibly read the War and Peace for every quarter on we've overcooked it. So I think it's important that we're selective and clear with our disclosure, and we're disclosing what matters, and we're communicating it really well.
Thank you. I think there was one final question. We're over time. Was there somebody? Oh, hi. Yeah, please. Oh, there's one more? Okay.
Hi, I'm Barnelli Chaudhary. I'm a professor at Osgoode Hall Law School. So I have two really, really quick questions. The first one is a follow-up to that gentleman's question about the Shell climate case in the UK. So, and perhaps this is directed to Rob, but I'm sure you know that in Delaware, which is the most important jurisdiction in the United States for corporate law, there are an increasing number of ESG cases now being brought under the duty of oversight. And I'm just curious as to whether or not you think that that similar trajectory is going to come here to Canada. I'm sure you already know that the first duty of oversight case has already been launched. It's not an ESG matter, but I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on that. And the second thing is that Seamus O'Regan, who is I believe he's the Minister for Labor for the federal government, has just announced, I think last week, that the government is going to introduce a new type of reporting regulation related to what we think is going to be similar to the European Union's approach on due diligence directive. That would require companies to either report on, we're not sure which way he's going to go, or be accountable for violations of human rights and environmental issues. And I'm just curious as to how you think that that's going to influence the way that boards are, I guess, going to change their stakeholder priorities, in that are we suddenly going to see a prioritization of human rights and environmental issues? Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's over to you, Rob.
Okay. To be honest, the duty of oversight stuff I've just started thinking about, so I don't have a developed answer. I think the question is building on the duty of care. Sorry? The Caremark case, yes. No, I'm familiar. I just haven't thought hard about how we would get it up and running under the Canadian legal framework, but I think it would be on the back of the duty of care. Do you agree with that? Yeah. Yeah. So I've started raising this duty of care stuff because I don't think we've thought enough about what we can do with it actually in Canada. It doesn't get talked about very much. Mm-hmm. People are focused all the time on fiduciary duties, fiduciary duty to the environment, fiduciary duty to employees. I'm really interested in looking harder at these duties of care, which require boards to think about the impact of their decisions on different groups. So I expect the duty of oversight jurisprudence from Delaware is going to infiltrate the way in which we're thinking about this stuff up here, but I don't have any predictions on where we're going to go. On the human rights issues, well, I mean, if a government decides as a matter of policy that it is imposing potentially sanctions for human rights violations, yeah, and the board's going to have to think about it as it does with go ahead, Bertrand. Yeah.
And I think, investors are always, like, when we invest in something, whether it's human rights things, it's like we're evil. But it's like climate change. Investors don't produce emissions, or very little. We have 1,500 employees in a building which is heated by green energy in Quebec. So, but the point is, it's a good thing, that's this type of things, because if we actually want the world to change, governments need to force it, and the companies that are responsible for this or that can control it and manage it need to do it. Companies should know what's in their supply chains, whether it's about climate change or whether it's about forced labor, and fix it. And so to us, it's very welcome.
Thank you. I know we have one more question, but we're over time, and I wonder if the person could approach after we finish, could approach the panelists and ask them directly. And please, I hope you'll stay. Bruce, would you like to?
Thanks, Catherine. As many of you know, this is the 20th anniversary for CCGG, and I think over that 20 years, the organization's worked very hard to play a leadership role in fostering discussion and debate about key governance issues that are of interest to, of course, our members, but also broader stakeholder communities. And I think this afternoon's discussion fits squarely in that tradition. So just thrilled that our guests, Robert and Barbara and Bertrand, would take the time to share their expertise with us, and of course Catherine for moderating so ably, and all of you for attending. So big thank you. Please join us in mingling after and meeting a new friend, and enjoy your evening. Thanks very much.